So welcome. It's so cool that there's so much interest, and I really hope we can get the questions happening as well, so you find that reciprocity in the group mind with you beautiful souls out there. So let us together, it's always a good time, even in the middle of the day, take a moment just to close down our eyes. I know Kara-Leah, you won't be, you'll be typing, but let us take a moment to close down our eyes together. Hmm. And take a moment to become comfortable. So, wherever you're sitting, whatever you're connected with, find a sense of comfortability within that. So, really allowing yourself to maybe widen your legs, put them on the ground, or cross your legs so that you can feel this lengthening of your spine. As we settle into the breath together, letting the breath move right down into the gut, right down low into the belly. We'll take a few breaths here together of inhaling and feeling that belly expanding, filling, and exhaling all together out through the nose, a long, slow exhale. Let us take a few more rounds of breath like that. As we're exhaling together, feeling our feet, our sitting bones softening down, down, down into the earth a little more. That descending. So on the exhale, letting your shoulders soften a little more, your jaws to soften. As we together arrive into this moment, together as a group, onto this cool, this inhaling, filling the belly, this exhaling, descending, sitting bones, feet, shoulders, tension in the jaw down into the earth. Feeling that center of our own self. Let us bring our awareness, just this last few moments together, into the physical heart space. Feeling the heart expanding, and even though you might not know the others on the call, just feeling this heart field connecting and weaving into one another. And this intention of allowing this space to be really a space of safety, of compassion, of curiosity. And then if you haven't already, just slowly allow your eyes to open.
Thank you so much, Sarsha.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So this is a conversation with Kara-Leah, and Sarsha, as you can see, is my guest this time around. She's a yogini and leads amazing ecstatic dance. I had the great pleasure of dropping into one a couple of weeks ago. And she trains ecstatic dance leaders as well. She is a mother and does lots of other awesome things as well, which I'm sure some of those we'll touch on. She lives in New Plymouth, right? That's where you are now, is New Plymouth? Yeah.
Yeah, living in New Plymouth in Namutu. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So Sarsha and I have been having a lot of conversations ourselves over the last 3 or 4 weeks. Sometimes it's like multiple voice messages back and forth. A little background, just so you know the context for what's led to this conversation. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, Matiu Te Huki invited me to co-facilitate on a retreat because his co-facilitator had decided to step back. And that was Sarsha. And there's a whole lot of things that unfolded as a result of that. And I've ended up not co-facilitating with Matiu on that particular retreat. Things came up around the student teacher or the participant facilitator relationship and just deeper understandings around that, which led to a wider conversation around ethics in the spiritual community, the conscious community. So I said to Sarsha, I'm like, you know what, we really got to take this conversation to the people. And here we are. So welcome, Sarsha.
Thank you. It's beautiful to actually be here and having this conversation finally. Yeah, as you said, we've had lots of voice messages back and forward, and I'm sure, like me, you've had conversations with the wider community. It's been really interesting talking to the wider community, and not just the spiritual community, not just the yoga community, which I also am from and through and lead trainings and that as well, but also the therapeutic community and the music community. It's actually been a really beautiful unfolding of a greater connection and a deeper conversation, and that's my hope for today, that we can keep diving into the conversation.
Yeah, that intersection, right, between, say, the yoga community, spiritual community, therapeutic community, the performance or the music community, and they all overlap in some ways, but then they're all coming from slightly different perspectives. But at the heart is relationship dynamics, power dynamics, and ethics, which is what we're here to talk about, really.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh,
And certainly one. Oh, yeah. You go.
No, go. You go.
You go.
No, you go.
What I was going to say is, yeah, from this unfolding and coming to this place was witnessing some, the comments on Facebook and the threads, and yeah, really realizing and understanding the lack of understanding and education in our community around ethics and around the power dynamics. And that's an interest of mine, of diving into why that is there. But that was really insightful to me, because it's something that, as I said, I'm a yoga teacher. I come really through the spiritual part. I actually come from a dance background, but then the yoga I've been teaching for 20 years and run teacher trainings. And so ethics is a part of the container. You have to have ethical policies in place to run your trainings, codes of conduct. We have to teach it. And it's been really enlightening for me, because I was always a bit like with Yoga Alliance, I was like, meh. And now I'm like, I'm really grateful that this is so clear, and that there's a governing body that makes it so clear, and that we have to teach it and speak to. And yeah, and how do we have a discussion, and how do we bring these thoughts and theories, because at the end of the day, I'm not saying they're right, I'm just saying, how do we bring this more into the public conversation?
Because even in the yoga community, like, I came through dance and then yoga as well. And I don't recall on my yoga teacher training, I mean, I don't remember what we covered. It was like 12 years ago now. But I don't recall us looking at teacher-student dynamics so much. I don't recall us looking at ethics on that training. I've self-educated around it. Like, Donna Farey's book on teaching and the relationship was huge. And part of why I started to self-educate was because in the early around 2012, I think it was, a lot of things started to happen in the yoga community with Bikram, with John Friend, later with Batabi Joyce, with Iyengar, all of these, some really serious abuses that were happening, not just because there's power abuse and there's sexual abuse, and there's overlaps there as well. So I do feel like the yoga community, as a result of that, has become a lot more aware. There's been a lot more discussions. But the yoga community and those who teach and facilitate in the yoga community, then we've got the spiritual community, like whatever that means, and people who haven't necessarily gone through trainings there, who have no understanding. Like you said in that conversation, it started to become quite aware that like a lot of people who are facilitating don't even recognize there is a power dynamic between participants and facilitators. Yeah, so having been in the yoga community for so long, and like you said, Yoga Alliance has ethics and guidelines, etc. Do you reckon the yoga community's got it sorted and we could use that as a...
No.
Okay,
That's why I said it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. And, yes, exactly. I think there's more awareness in the yoga world because there's been so many transgressions of the teacher student, and I would almost say the guru student, and there's definitely that outdated model that I personally really feel needs to go. So these transgressions have continued to happen, and I think when I entered into the yoga world, like I've been practicing for 25 years, and Yoga Alliance didn't exist when I started teaching. I did a diploma in yoga teacher training. It was like 2 years, and it was partly online and it was partly in person, and we would do like monthly assessments and assignments that we would send into our teacher. So it was a really beautiful, set in a much more classical pathway, but that was where I came from. And so Yoga Alliance, I don't actually know how long it's been around for, but it is newer as far as the yoga world goes. And it's interesting, I think definitely since Yoga Alliance has been there, more of these transgressions have come to light. And maybe that, and I'm just thinking this now, maybe that is because there is a governing body that has spoken to ethics, and there's been a pathway that's been created for people to feel safe enough and come forward and talk about this. But I definitely don't believe that we've got it all sorted at all. And I think, it's interesting because we talk about this, also the spiritual world and whatever pathways, and I'm interested, and I don't know, so I'd love to hear from people that maybe are coming through the breathwork pathways and the cacao ceremony pathways, if they have governing bodies, if they have ethical guidelines that are taught, student dynamic that are taught. I'd be interested to hear that because I don't actually know. I've asked a few people, but I'd love to educate myself and do a little bit more research around that. And then, of course, we have the Neo-Tantra world intersecting as well. So there's so many layers here. Yeah. We have the Neo-Tantra that, and through the Ista, I'm not sure if all Neo-Tantra teachings are the same, but I know through the Ista world, they're very clear that it's okay to sleep with your students. So I can see why there's so many varied views and what's right and what's wrong and, does it matter? And I can see on one hand where Ista's coming from, like the way they talk about it is that, the blanket rule of don't sleep with your student is clearly not working. And we can see that in the yoga world, right?
Yeah. I mean, look at Rod Stryker. The guy has really clear ethics. He had an ethics board, and then he had a year-long emotional relationship with a student that culminated in physical intimacy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of like, it's that thing of like, if we just push it into the shadow and just say a blanket no, then that doesn't work. But I personally feel that it's okay to sleep with your students. I think there's just too many layers of conditioning, and I think it has to be something that's done very, very mindfully and very, very consciously if it does unfold. I'm definitely not a person that is a no, never, ever, it's just never okay, because I think a post you put up the other day, there was a woman yoga teacher that said she met her husband in her yoga class, and I was just talking to my neighbour today, and she said she was at a training and she found out that the facilitator on that ended up dating, and she was a much younger woman, but they're together 3 years later and they got a baby and they're married.
Yeah. Rodney Yee, another good example of someone who began dating his student who became his wife and his co-facilitator, and they've been together for however long.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's a comment here from Kim saying, you know, appreciate the link to Yoga Alliance, but I don't think they actually govern much because there's not much follow-up from them. So that's a really good point, right? You can have the guidance or the pathway or the ethics, but if no one's paying attention, and how do you pay attention? How do you assess things as such? So that's one comment there.
I would agree, and that's why I've always been a bit like that about Yoga Alliance, because that's been my experience. But after this conversation, I'm kind of like, at least it's something. It's better than nothing. But I totally agree, Kim. I don't see them following up. Yeah. I know they don't check. Like, I put in my curriculum and they never check. Like, once you're passed, they never check anything. I could be put in my curriculum and then teach whatever I want.
Yeah. It's a rubber stamping thing, right? Yeah. There's a great question here from AJ saying, what do you want to see more of from the men in this community? And what is needed from the male practitioners in this field?
Oh, that is such a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is such a good question. Yeah. I think, yeah, what do we want to see from the males in this field? I think, and I don't know if this is, and you've spoken to this, I don't know if it's necessarily just a male issue, but it does tend to show up in, like, the way power dynamics show up in men is different to women, right? So I think there's that acknowledgement as well. So I think, and I'm saying that because I think as facilitators, I think I would love to see us all understanding that we are in a power dynamic when we're in the teacher-student relationship. And I feel like that's just across the board. And, you know, as a teacher, I feel that, I know that. And I also know when I get to know, say it's students being through one of my trainings and then they start to assist me and they get to know me more personally, I feel that power dynamic start to dissolve. Like, so firstly, just the acknowledgement that it's there and how we respect that. And I think that's just generally across the board. I think for men, and that's a really great question, I think, and this is another layer, is the part of the reason why the power dynamic is there because of the patriarchal conditioning. It's like this invisible ocean that we're all swimming in. And so there's these dynamics that what happens is we're conditioned from a very young, and the patriarchy affects all of us, men and women. And, you know, women and girls are not taught to say no. We're not conditioned to kind of stand in our power, say no, and be more fierce. And boys from a young age, you know, I mean, I could go on and on and on about that, but I'm keeping it direct to answer this question. And boys from a young age are not taught to feel, you know, harden up, especially in New Zealand, like harden up, just get on with it. So what I see is there's this disconnect. So, you know, in these dynamics, it's easy to go, oh, woman, you just need to work on your boundaries, but there's so many layers around that because of our cultural collective conditioning. And for men, because they have been so conditioned in a certain way, I think there's this not really potentially feeling as much as they could the impact of their actions. And I know that's probably not a direct, the thing is I think it's such a difficult question. It's like, well, what do we do? I think, you know, it's like there's so many layers to it. But I think if we just start all acknowledging that there is this deep cultural conditioning from the patriarchy that generally just gives men more power. They're conditioned to take up space more. They don't apologize as much. They're bigger, they're stronger. Men have, you know, some men have, but, you know, 1 in 3 women in New Zealand are being sexually abused. You know, so a greater understanding of these things, of like, as a facilitator, when you go into these spaces, this is what you're dealing with.
Yeah, and it's so important to understand that when abuse happens, it's not just a one-time event and it's done and dusted. That abuse literally rewires the nervous system, the defensive mechanisms, the way that someone receives information from and responds to their environment, right? And so one thing that what you're saying there, so there's a comment saying, does it even need to be gender specific? And no, I mean, from the perspective of, we're talking about power. In essence, we're talking about people with power. How do they hold that power in a responsible way? And also, as Sarsha just laid out, because of conditioning, the way that men and women wield power is often quite different. Women, when they wield power, when they're doing it unconsciously, it tends to be like emotional manipulation, criticism, vindictiveness, like really tearing down someone on an emotional level as such. Power, and we're talking too about the difference here between power over, when people are operating from power over rather than centered in power and responding to what's unfolding. So I think understanding conditioning and how things are gender specific is really important. Understanding, like you just said, Sarsha, that the abuse history of the general population is really important. There was one other thing that I wanted to highlight that you mentioned. So when you spoke about how men, and we're generalizing here, absolutely generalizing, but men in general are conditioned not to feel, so therefore it can be more challenging for them to feel the impact of their actions. So something in that as well is, my sense is that because that inability to feel, then they're not as tuned into what's actually happening on the more subtle layers of communication, on the energetic layers. So as a facilitator and a participant, if the man is a facilitator and what he's sensing and responding to, he's not necessarily picking up on that subtle stuff and responding to that per se.
Yeah. I'd also like to add, going back to AJ's question of, what do we want to see from men? I'd also like to ask, what do men need from us so that they feel safer to join the conversation, to speak up of their own experiences, Because I think the only way that we're going to move to a healthier dynamic that we all want to see, because at the end of the day, we all, as facilitators, we all reflect on one another. It's like, how do we create these spaces? Because, I although I've highlighted these things, I really want to avoid shaming men and shaming, we all have the masculine energy within us. It's just like men have the feminine energy. So it's kind of like, what is it that you need from us to feel safe to speak up more so that we have a deeper understanding of where you're coming from as well? That's a question. That doesn't need to be answered, but I just want to put that in there.
I feel like that's so important. And when I invited Matiu, in essence, to do an conversation with me, that's what I was so aware of, that it just felt so important to me to be able to hold that space with unconditional love, with orientation to truth. So he felt safe to share really vulnerable things to the best of his ability in that moment. And if we want men to step up or step forward, we want anybody to step up or step forward. From my perspective, it just feels so important that we are caring and we're compassionate and we're loving. And like the teachings in Tantra are that anyone is doing the best they can in this moment based on their level of conditioning and their level of awareness. So even someone who is, abusing someone else, in that moment, actually doing the best they can. And if they turn around and go, I want to sort my shit out, tearing them down is not going to support that process. But being loving and holding them to account will support that. But what I would love to see from men in our community, I would love to see men holding each other to account. I would love to see men noticing if someone's got a dodgy relationship to power and having a man-to-man, heart-to-heart conversation about it. So it's not just, because I sometimes feel like it's the woman's job to call this shit out. I'm like, where are the men here? Why is someone else not? Why are the men not, going? And I've heard men bitch about other men, but behind their back as such.
Wow.
And I am aware of some men in our community who have done exactly that. They've gone to men and said, hey, your behavior is not okay and it's harming people, and we would really love to see you operate in a different way. That's what I want to see more of.
Yeah, I would totally 100% agree on that. Like, I think like if any of you followed the post that Matiu put in all the comments after, it was such a beautiful analogy, or just not even an analogy, it was a direct insight to where we are in our human conditioning. And that was one thing that I definitely saw a lack of, is men lovingly calling other men to account, and I also see that in the greater community. So I would totally agree with you there, because it feels sometimes a little bit like, especially for us, I guess, women that have been in the community for a long time, we're a little bit older, we're a little bit wiser, and we kind of end up in these roles of like the Kali role of like, this is not okay, no. When we've got more comfortable with our nose.
Yeah. I mean, I have been getting on the phone to some men and going, can you do this? I've been asking directly and saying, can you please talk to this person, about their behavior? So, because that's what I would love to see. All right, we've got another comment here from Benjamin saying, I think boundaries, and when people don't feel comfortable with having boundaries, is when a lot of problems start. But how do you encourage people to have boundaries in the moment? What are your thoughts on boundaries there, Sarsha?
Yeah. Again, there's so many layers to boundaries, like one of the things that I teach in my women's retreats that I run down south is, what did you learn about saying no? And this is for men and for women. But right, so no is like your base, one of your basic boundaries, right? And it's like, what were you taught when it's one of the first words that we say is no. And often, in our direct family unit, in the wider community, as a toddler and as a child, it's not okay to say no to people in power. It's like, don't you say no to me? Like, what were we taught about saying no? And that's part of the reason why we find it's all very well to say you need to get clearer on your boundaries, but if you haven't gone back and really looked at the ways that we were taught to say no, and how to say no, and how to set boundaries, it leads to so many things. I went through this in my own process of like, if I say no, what are all of these people going to think about me? And am I going to let people down? It's not just the no and the boundary, and this is my boundary and my values. It's all of the conditioning that we have on top of that. So I think it's like understanding boundaries. What are they? What is our conditioning around it? What happens when we say no? And that pattern of wanting to say no and then apologizing, that's another thing. It's like, no, but I'm sorry, da 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 da. Like, how comfortable are we just saying it's a no without needing to over explain or to set boundaries? And there's always, whether it's men or women, especially in a training container or a workshop container, it's all very well, I know even as a facilitator, we can set up these containers where we say everything is invitational, you can say no, but then you're in the moment and the rest of the group is doing it, and it's so easy to get swayed by that. I think we're taught from such a young age to give our power away, to teachers, to doctors outside of ourselves. So often from an embodiment perspective, we don't even know what no is in our body. And then if we've got the extra layer of trauma on top of that, it's really difficult, and it can work in both ways with trauma, where trauma is triggered because of a past experience, and it's actually stopping us from unfurling into a safe container and finding spaces to be able to rewire our nervous system. So again, it's not a straightforward answer. But it doesn't mean that we can't learn about it and inquire into it, but there's just many layers to it.
And I think too often people don't recognize or realize that a lot of this stuff is unconscious, that the conditioning in the body is so strong that people, like, there's not a recognition. So when it comes to boundaries, the human animal, my understanding from my direct experience and studies, the human animal will take the choice that leads to safety.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether it's a yes or a no, the human animal will go, it's safer to say yes. It's safer to fawn. It's safer to tend and befriend, right? Which is, in the nervous system, you got fight, flight, freeze, tend and befriend, or fawn. And that we're hardwired for safety.
Yeah.
So that's going to take precedence over any intellectual understanding of boundaries until the nervous system is literally rewired through work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so I think going back to these questions, I think one of the biggest things we can do as facilitators is inform ourselves around trauma and do some education around that. That's something, like, out of these conversations, what I would love to see is people understanding ethics and the power dynamics more, and facilitators doing some. It doesn't need to be it doesn't need to be, you don't necessarily need to do a whole, like, 2-3 year diploma in it, but I think some kind of basic understanding. And there are facilitators out there that are running, like, I know a woman, Amanda Hanna, who runs Soma Psych, that I'm a guest facilitator. She does a 300-hour trauma-informed teacher training, but she also does just a 20-hour online that's coming up at the end of August, and I'm happy to put some links to that kind of stuff. So I think because it's so nuanced, and because, as we've talked about, there's so many layers, it's like, okay, well, what can we do on practical levels? And I think upskilling ourselves as facilitators on trauma is one of those keys, because then we learn to understand as a facilitator whether what we're seeing is a true no, like, oh, that's a no for them, like, they're just not wanting to go there, and I'm going to accept that and help support them into doing what they need to do to listen to themselves at the moment, or to resource themselves, or this is just actually their resistance, and it's important that we know that as facilitators, and are able to feel what their boundary is. Like, is this just a pattern condition of just no, or I'm having a trauma response, which are two very different things. An emotional response, release, and a trauma response are two very different things, how we deal with them in a space. And or am I as a facilitator just going to gently guide them through that resistance? So they can understand a deeper layer of themselves.
And that comes back again. So just want to talk about the way that we learn things. There's intellectual understanding and learning, but then there's embodied understanding and learning. And that sense of being able to respond, that someone, like you said, someone might say no, but it's a resistance no that can be worked with skillfully. Someone might say yes, but it's an actual no. And to be able to sense that, right? And go, oh, I'm hearing you say yes, but I'm feeling you say no, right?
Yeah.
And as a facilitator, I want to honor the felt body sense that the person is transmitting, but I need to know what that is. I need to be able to feel it, right? So let's look at a few specifics here. Kim's coming on and saying the ethics framework would ideally speak to the boundaries relating to the power dynamics. So in a very practical sense, one thing I've heard you talk about over the last few weeks, Sarsha, is the idea of creating some kind of ethical guidelines for facilitators and sending it out to festivals, so that anyone who is facilitating on a festival, that everyone's on the same page with ethical guidelines. Can you speak into that?
Sure. And so that's one of my things that's come out of this. And just yesterday, actually, I was looking over my own ethical guidelines and codes of conduct that I've got within my yoga school, and the guidelines that I do have speak very clearly to that. Like, it is, I think, as I said, there's so many nuances, and I really don't believe in a full blanket no. But I think as we get, say, in this example of festivals, although then, I've been thinking about that more too, and it's got its challenges. Like, sometimes, like ecstatic dance at NZ Spirit, I don't know how many hundreds of people were there.
There are a lot. Oh my God, I saw the photo and I'm just
How would I know whether, how would I know whether they were at my dance or not? And that's why I think in those situations it's actually just more straightforward to have a blanket no. And if we have some ethical guidelines that are written and reviewed by a few of us, and then sent out to festival organisers, because in my experience, and I haven't taught at heaps, I've actually only been teaching at festivals for the last 2-3 years. It's not like I've done many of them, but I've done a few, and I haven't seen in my experience anywhere when you get accepted as a facilitator that these are the guidelines. And I think it would be just a really great way to begin to educate facilitators around there's always a power dynamic. This is the ethical conduct that we expect from you in this place, that that it's a no, it is a power dynamic. The student-teacher relationship, it just is a power dynamic. And that's a lot of it, as I said, is cultural conditioning as well. So we're so conditioned to give our power away so easily and so readily. And I'm a woman who's done a lot of work herself, and I know even myself, when I met my teacher, Tara Judell, I was like, oh my God, I could feel myself putting her on this pedestal. I was aware enough to know that I was doing it, but I was still doing it. And that's woman to woman, So it's like it's just like naming it, that this is the reality of what is there, and creating policies for people to read through and to sign. I mean, in my ideal world, it would actually be through a Zoom call with all the facilitators. I think that would be a beautiful way to bring facilitators together to get on the same page, same intention of what we want to create, the feeling in these festivals, but also a level of education. And I'm also aware of all the nuances of, well, there might be hundreds of people at your class. And what about the musicians? So then we go, well, the one thing for the facilitators, what about the musicians,
Mm-hmm. Or the healers working in the healing zone.
Yeah, so that's been interesting, as I've been having conversations with healers working in the healing zone, and similar stories of them maybe seeing other healers that they didn't feel were holding up, the best ethics and ethical guidelines, and hearing that from people that have been to see healers in these spaces. So I think they really we need to raise more awareness and more education just across the board around this.
Yeah. And I mean, the conversation's definitely been started.
Yeah. And for me as well, like what I've noticed is, like, I teach this stuff on my trainings, but I was always just kind of like, isn't this common sense? Meh, like I'll teach it because I think it's important, but I didn't ever spend a whole lot of time on it. And now I'm like, oh, we're going to spend more time on this, and we're really going to dive into embodied boundaries and what that feels like. I mean, I teach embodiment, so we do a lot of embodiment anyway, but this extra layer of that. So I took it for granted that people understood this. I really did.
Yeah, but nah.
It's a classic Kiwi say, yeah, but nah.
Yeah, when you look at my conversation with Matiu, and he genuinely, appeared to, what he was saying was he didn't understand some of these dynamics. It hadn't occurred to him.
Yeah, and I know, I mean, him and I have been having this conversation probably for a couple of years, but I think the layers and the nuances of it maybe had not fully landed for him. Yeah.
And I think that's important to sort of point out, when transgressions were being brought up with him, it wasn't that he was necessarily sleeping with participants that he'd been on his workshops. It was more, not finesse, it's the wrong word. It was more subtle than that, but it was still sort of that's as soon as there's a power dynamic, shit's going down. And when I feel into this, what I keep coming back to is our relationship as human beings to power.
Yes.
Right? Like when I imagine, like, what would it feel like to be part of a community of people where everyone was in their power? Then these conversations actually become redundant. When everyone's simply in power, redundant. So it, in some ways, it's not even about the ethics. It's not even about the guidelines. It's about embodied sense of being in power. What does it mean to be in power? What does it mean to not be in power? to recognize the strategies that people use to try and feel powerful as such. Kim says ethical guidelines may not change some people's behavior, but it enables all the avenues to know what's expected, and it helps people speak up and be supported.
Yeah, I think that's a key, right? If this education's happening, and then like we said before, like what do we want to see from men calling other men to account? I think, just within our community, if that education's there, then we can all hold one another accountable lovingly. It's like, hey, remember that ethical guidelines that we signed? I'm a little bit concerned about what I'm seeing at this time. We can all, like Kim says, that education can be there, and then we can all come on board and hold one another to account around it, and begin to, my hope is, build a new culture around this. And then the next level, as you say, would be this understanding, this empowerment, from this place within. And I think that I think we have a wee way to go there. It's definitely, this, I don't even like to call myself a teacher anymore. Like, I call myself a space holder, a facilitator, because even the word teacher, it kind of puts me in this position. It's like, I just happen to know quite a lot about this topic because I've dedicated a lot of time and practice to it. But that does not mean I have, that I know everything at all, but it's interesting how, the questions people have asked me, they're like, I've got this injury, what do you think I should do about that? I'm like, I think you should go see a physio. I can give you some
scope,
right? For it.
Yeah.
It's really interesting what shows up, like this, just they think because you're a yoga teacher who has some kind of spiritual understanding, then you know a whole lot more than what you actually do. Like, say, scope of practice. I think that's another really important thing that I would like to see more understanding around. What is our scope of practice? What are we actually educated to deliver?
Yeah, it's a big one, scope of practice. I did a mind-body certificate, mind-body therapy certificate, and one of the big things that we covered all of these different approaches and learned different approaches to therapy, etc. And one of the things covered was, what's your scope of practice? What are you trained and certified and have the experiential understanding to deliver? And like we said at the beginning, there's a real overlap here between, say, spiritual, therapeutic, academic. There's like an intersection. I'm curious to know, Sarsha, how would you define the difference between therapeutic interventions and spiritual interventions?
Yeah. Yes, that's another really good question, right? Is like the I think this understanding that, spirituality is spirituality and therapy is therapy, for a start, and they're quite different in the way that they work. But I think also this, nevertheless, they're both potent and powerful and transformational containers that we can put ourselves in. Yeah. So say for me, with my dance training in particular, like, it's a 10-day ecstatic dance training, and it's intense. And I've had, like, this will be the 4th year that we've run this. So we've run it a number of times. We've had like nearly 100 students through it. And, the feedback is that it's, it's a really intense container. They de-layer. It's a spiritual, shamanic soul container. That's what it is. And I've had this feedback of people come out into the world and they're kind of like, whoa, how do I fit in? Because there's so much internal change that then they go out into the world and they're like, how do I fit in? So my learning, and it's definitely been my learning, is to understand, even though I speak about you may need therapy after this to help integrate, and here's some therapists, I'm understanding I need to speak to that even more, and even leading into the training of, like, you're really going to need time to integrate, and speak about from past students' experiences of what they've talked about and their challenges with it, and just speak to that more and more. But that understanding that there is a difference. And I think, I think in there's a difference, and there's a difference in understanding that, and like you say, our scope of practice. And I think it's really important to understand, if you're a therapist, you come from that, you have a really strong code of ethics, and you'll generally have a body behind you, but it doesn't, you know, and I think there's this, what I'm seeing in some of the comments is that there then can be this hierarchy of like, I've got this, I come from more of an academic background, so I know, and there's a lot of benefit to therapy. I've done a lot of therapy. I have regular supervision as a facilitator. That's something else I would like to see more of, facilitators getting their own supervision. But then I don't think we can negate the way that someone who comes from a deep spiritual practice, that has a regular meditation practice and years of that, building their awareness, building their awareness to the subtlety of energy and shift and change, building their awareness around their embodiment, I think that is as of equal value. So I feel like what I'd like to see is a greater, instead of kind of, I'm seeing a little bit of a conversation around one's better than the other. What I'd like to see is a conversation of like, how do we understand the gifts that we are both offering, and how do we support one another, and how do we deepen the conversation here, as well as being clear of what our scope of practice is. Like, you wouldn't expect your therapist, unless they've done a yoga teacher training, to start teaching you yoga. In the session, here's the therapy, and by the way, here I think you should do these downward dogs and da 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 da, or embodiment practice. If they haven't done a lot of embodiment practices themselves. So yeah, I think that scope of practice.
So could you define the difference then? Because it is dealing with much of the same, it's transformation of self as such. It's dealing with the mental, emotional, it's dealing with the nervous system, it's dealing with trauma resolution quite often. I'm just curious to know if because I got a few different ideas on it, on what do you think is the difference between the spiritual transformation approach and the therapeutic transformation approach?
Lord, that's a good question.
Yeah. Can I offer something then while you contemplate?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Yeah. So my sense is that the major difference is the way that reality itself is perceived. So from a spiritual perspective, what we are is awareness or consciousness. And within that awareness or consciousness arises the contents, which are thoughts, feelings, defense mechanisms, nervous system responses, trauma, right? But what we are is awareness. And so that's a particular lens. And I know when I work with people, mostly what I'm doing is supporting them to have the capacity and the willingness to be with what's arising. And that's it, to just be with what's there, right? Whereas therapy tends to have a different kind of lens where the sense of what we are as awareness is just not there at all. Yeah. What a person is seen as the identity of the thoughts and the feelings and the history and the story of me as such. So my feeling is that's one of the major differences between the approaches, is that in the therapeutic model, and I'm generalizing here because some therapeutic models like Hakomi, for example, they do have a different lens. But the therapeutic model tends to think a person is their thoughts, feelings, their history, their stories, their trauma. That's what they are. Whereas in the spiritual transformative model, what a person is awareness.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah, I would agree. And that's like when you ask us, like, whoa, because there's so many different therapies as well. So
yeah, that's
just
so
like
this is a generalization.
Spiritual traditions as well, and you and I come from a similar spiritual path of teaching awareness, tantra, embodiment, so we're similar. But someone, say in classical hatha, might say something different again. So there's so many different layers to it. And from my understanding, often therapy is much more cognitive. It's much more talk style of like we're talking through this. And I think not always, it depends on the therapist that you're going to see, right? But often it's cognitive, and it's from here up, and it's talking about experiences and processing them and being heard. And that is a really important and really valuable process. And in my experience, through dance and through, because my yoga teacher training is embodied flow, so it's embodiment, first and foremost, it's embodiment. And what I've noticed is that students will come and they'll be like, and even in my women's retreats, people will be like, I've done therapy on this, but then they go into their body and then they're like, whoa, it's like the body keeps the score. I guess this is this interweaving that we see of this. It's a relatively new field of trauma-informed awareness, is because they're understanding the body piece more, which is where, as yoginis, as, you know, Shakti advocates, embodiment dance, you know, that's where we're coming from more, is like, this body keeps a score, it keeps a record of everything. And then when you go in there, things are going to come up and out. I think also generally therapy is one-on-one. So I don't do one-on-ones, I do group. And that's why I'm very aware of, like, you might need to go see somebody one-on-one to integrate after this, because this is a group experience of, as you said, bringing awareness to self, like that awareness of that we are everything and it is us. And I think, you know, from my teaching perspective, is also broadening into this, we are everything and it is us, and broadening the capacity to be able to see, as Rumi would say, we're the universe in ecstatic motion. You know, why are you playing so small? And so on my trainings, that's definitely one of my through lines, is to, like, you know, we've had this human experience and we need to acknowledge that. And I think that's what therapy does so well. And then we are a soul. And we are more than that. You know?
Yeah. And there is so much intersection happening now as well. Like what you just said, Dr. Gabor Mate's work. Oh my goodness. When I watched the documentary and read the book, I was like, oh, wow, I feel like he's speaking to the work I'm doing with people, but he's laying it out in a different kind of way. And it was so refreshing to see that intersection starting to happen of the somatics of it all.
I think that's the field that we're going to see growing more and more and more. And again, you know, my hope is that there'll be more, you know, there'll be some bodies governing that, and, you know, these ethical guidelines and codes of conduct as this field grows, you know, whatever pathway you're moving into it from.
One thing I noticed too is that, you know, as teachers or as facilitators, I've been really aware that I can only ever lead students as far as I have gone.
Yes.
And right. And
totally, I teach that all the time.
Yeah. And then so looking at some facilitators, they might have learned breath work, for example, but if they haven't done a lot of inner work, then their ability to hold and respond to people that they're leading in breath work will be far more limited. And I think that is where there is, I don't want to use the word danger, but I'm aware, you know, at festivals, people are leading very powerful group processes that can totally bring up all kinds of shit that the facilitator doesn't necessarily have the capacity or the time to hold. Yeah.
I think
that's a biggie, right?
It's a biggie, and I actually think as you're speaking to that, I'm realizing, mainly because I've been looking for it myself. I'm always, you know, doing continuing education. There's a lot of trainings around how to, you know, hold one-on-one space and to understand trauma from a one-on-one viewpoint. But there's actually not a lot of trainings around how to hold safely and well group containers. Like, there's just not. You know, it's like, I don't necessarily want to go and do a 3-year diploma that's specifically, it might touch on group work, but it's actually specifically designed for one-on-one work. And there's actually, I'm really seeing that missing. Like, there's not a lot of, like, how do we apply all of these things we're talking about to the group container? And like you say, and so then it shows up in festivals where breath work, it's powerful, right?
Freaking powerful, yeah.
It's really powerful. And, you know, I've seen these discussions be had of, like, is there spaces, like, whose responsibility is it is it the facilitator, is it festival organizers to create spaces if people have had a big experience and they need to process it more? Like, where do they go? So this is something as a community that we need to speak more to. It's like, if people are having experiences, like, how many assistants should you have in the space, you know, when you're holding these deep containers? And, you know, and there's so many different layers. Like, I think this would be, you know, a different, again, differentiating, excuse me, between therapeutic and more soul work. And often, you know, in soul work or spirit work, it's done in group containers, and there's the energetics, you know, like, what is the whole energy that you're creating? How do you work with that? How do you set up a safe space and a safe field? Because you're literally taking them through processes that open their fields up so massively. Are we grounding people, settling them, regulating their nervous systems at the end? Are we giving them advice? If you're feeling activated, where do you go to from there? You know, and as I'm saying this, I'm like, you know, I definitely could have paid more attention to that after leading an ecstatic dance at NZ Spirit. You know, it was like, I didn't speak to that of like, and if you've got stuff coming up, and that's the other thing of like, you've just, you know, for me personally, I just held a big space to hundreds of people. You know, my energy spent
right
in that moment. You know, so like, this is why it's much easier in a train when you're running trainings, because you have assistants and it's very clear. It's like, if you're still needing to process stuff at lunchtime, then that's what the assistants are there for, because I've just taught for whatever 3 hours straight, and I need a break because I can't hold anybody anymore, you know.
I think what I'd like to see at festivals is a space that is personed, not manned, but personed, that basically is like the blowout room. Maybe. And so all facilitators know, all participants know that if you've gone through a workshop and you're feeling a little bit shaky in any way, shape or form, you go to the blowout room and you are held and supported, and whatever you need is responded to. And I think that kind of space really needs to be happening. You know, it's like kind of a little bit like first aid, but it's so much more than that, because the people that hold that space need to be next level at what they're doing.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, it's like, and it would be amazing if the people that were holding that space were trained therapists. That's exactly what we're talking about. You know, it's like the deep spirit work in these containers. And then, yes, sometimes people need to be held by a therapist to help them integrate what they've experienced. And it's like, how do we weave these two together and then have conversations, you know, like facilitators going to the therapist and going, oh, what happened with that participant, you know, in confidentiality. I mean, that's the other thing, confidentiality.
Yeah. And we're getting a lot of yeses, amazing, and love hearts and claps on this piece. So I think this is something we definitely have to propose to the festival organisers. And I think you're right. I think the people holding that space need to be a combination of those who can work with the energetic field and those who are therapists. I think you need both. I mean, ideally, therapists that can do that would be amazing, but I think both is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, you would think that the type of therapist that would be attracted to coming to a festival would have the therapist friends that I know have a really good balance of both. You know, they're they have their own spiritual practice, so they have that infuses their practice. But, you know, it's the same as like, right, you have your first aid tent. You're assuming, of course, that there's going to be people that are trained in first aid that are at that tent. So it would be the same with this tent. It'd be like me manning the first aid tent. It was like, I can put a plaster on it, but that's about my limit.
Well, I'm just looking at my notes here to see if we've covered a lot of ground already. Getting some big yeses on the integration. Okay, let me just feel and see if there's anything else that's required to ask. I do want to ask a little bit about your own personal experience, Sarsha, in terms of making that decision to step back from facilitating with Matiu and then watching the fallout. Because you were in both a professional and a personal relationship with him. How did you feel as a woman watching what happened and being a part of it? You know that people are going to be wanting me to ask that question.
Of course, and I'm happy to speak to it for sure. Yeah. Is there a specific question, or do you just want me to speak to how the experience was for me?
Yeah, I think just reflecting, there's that decision to step back. How
Mm,
hard was it to
mm,
make that? What went into making that decision to step back from co-facilitating?
mm. Yeah, it was. And this is so for me. I have a daily practice. I've been practicing meditation for years, embodiment for years, and to still process this and really find my truth was definitely a difficult process. It was so interesting watching you know, all of the different conditionings that would come up around not wanting to disappoint the students. Like, what are the students going to think? What is mana going to think? On a professional business level, like, what are they going to think? Um, how's Matiu going to take this? If I did this to him, how would I feel about this? Just all of the different layers. So I'd also like to add, not only do I have, a regular practice, meditation, embodiment, I also have a really strong council of sisters that are all very wise. And, so that reference as well. And brothers, I have some really beautiful brother energy in my life that these kind of things of like, I'll sit with it and then I'll be like, I'll go to this person and ask them for advice. So it was such a deep process of like what feels like my truth. And like you say, there was the personal experience, although we had stepped back from having an intimate connection for a while before this decision. So there was sitting with that as well, like, can I let this, the personal connection, I don't want that impacting this decision, because I know it's going to, it's a challenging decision to make. There was also my life path as a woman of, what was, and some of you might have read my post that I wrote about, the process that I went through. And I think one of the sort of like working through it all, one of the aha moments, because I was really like, like if I say no, how, this part of us that wants to know how it's all going to work out, and how can I look after everybody, and is anybody going to get pissed off with me? Like,
Yeah.
there's still that deep part of us that want to be liked. It's like, I don't know if that ever goes away. And I think that's a good thing, right? Because otherwise we just walk around being assholes.
Well, don't know about that. But but
What?
listening to you, that's what I'm picking up, is a sense of like you kind of knew what you needed to do, is what I'm sensing, but
Yeah.
you were concerned about how's it going to impact all of these people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I wonder if that is more of a feminine thing, to worry about all of it, rather than to just go, this is what I need to do and it's done. Fuck you all.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, not quite, but almost like just a sense of trusting that Mana would get it, trusting that Machi would get it, and if he didn't, that was his shit. Trusting that the students would get it, and if they didn't, that was their stuff, right?
Yeah. I think it's, yeah, definitely like that feminine, we nurture and we create connection. That's part of what we do. Like, we build communities and we nurture. It's like it's inbuilt into us. So there's definitely that aspect. And then there's also this part of the feminine that the feminine is comfortable in the unknown, right? The masculine likes to know. It likes to be linear. It likes to be rational. It likes to have all the figures and facts. And we very much live in a world like that. Whereas the feminine is more comfortable with the unknown and the dissolving and the dissolution, we could say, from those pure aspects of feminine and masculine. And one of the things that helped me create my clarity is I separated from a 22-year marriage like nearly 2 years ago. And I really had to step into the not knowing. Like, I don't know how this is going to work out. I don't know how I'm going to manage. I just don't know. And it built a really strong resilience and trust in myself. And my mantra literally at that time was just keep putting one foot in front of the other. And it was interesting. That was almost like the moment of truth, is like I'd been deliberating over it and talking to people, and had women coming and talking to me about their experiences. So that was the other thing, and wanting to be seen. I feel really blessed that the woman trusted to come and talk to me. Like, even though they knew I was working with them, they still trusted me to come and talk to me. So I really honor the woman for that, and I'm really grateful for that. So there was a big part of me that's, I can't just ignore that, especially when I teach all of these things, and I also teach listening to my body. So it was two moments of truth that kind of made me go, I just have to say no. I teach listening to my body, and I know my body's saying no, and my head is trying to figure it all out. I know my head is trying to make sure everybody else is okay, and I'm trying to figure out how it's going to unravel and what I can do about it. And then the part of me that just went, I've let go of way harder things and it's worked out. This is actually a small thing in the big scheme of things. I mean, I didn't expect it to come out so publicly. That was not my intention. That was not my desire. No. I was like, and I was really feeling for Matiu. I was like, whoa, this is intense. This is an intense unfolding. Yeah. That was not my intention at all, and it was funny because even, in our conversations, when you decided not to step up, I was like, oh, okay, now really, like, the retreat's really not going ahead. All right. And there's that small part of me, like, it would have been just easier if it just went ahead, but the deeper knowing that it's like, that is not for the best for this to go ahead at the moment.
Yeah, it was, when Matiu asked me, I just sort of said yes. I didn't know why you'd stepped back at that point in time, but I also had it in me. I was like, oh, I need to talk to Sarsha. And of course, as you know, I reached out and I spoke to you, and then was like, okay, and same thing. It's like, okay, what needs to happen next? And which is when I said to Matiu, look, we have to name and acknowledge everything that's in the field. That needs to happen. There's just one thing I want to speak to about the interview that I did with Matiu. So I was quite nervous in that interview because I really wanted to hold that unconditional love space and also accountability and truth. And in the past, I had a tendency toward people pleasing and accommodating, and I've tended to be intimidated by, in particular, men in power. So I was aware of all that going in. And there was, I think it was toward the end of the interview, like, I recorded the interview, and afterwards I felt so exposed and like, holy moly, do I really want to publish this? This is really full on. This is just going to explode. And then when I reflected back over the interview, I was like, oh shit, that was something I shouldn't have said. And so it was really interesting, because it was such a long interview as well, but it was part of the interview, and I couldn't, I don't tend to edit things out. I tend to let things flow. And so I did, and it got published and all the things happened. And then about a week or so later, I got an email from a woman saying, I enjoyed your interview. This was good. And that was great. She goes, but when you said this, when it's not okay, what you said, and and she just called me out, and I'll get to what it was in a moment. And I just responded to her and I said, yeah, you're totally right. I fucked up. That was not okay. And I think this is part of this power dynamics thing, is when we're willing to own up to and just name and say, yeah, you're right. That wasn't cool. I fucked up in that moment and I'm aware of it. So the piece I'm referring to in the interview is when I said to Matiu, I said something along the lines of, I suggested to him that he not engage with women who aren't fully in their power. And of course, it just was not a good thing to say, because of what it implied in terms of the women he had been engaged with, and just so many nuances. It was clumsy, it was inaccurate, and it would have been potentially caused harm to the women. So that's one thing that I wanted to just say, is that navigating this territory is difficult. stepping up and speaking up is challenging, and we will mess up. All of us will mess up. And I feel like it's really important for me, as I'm just going to speak from my own purpose, for me to just acknowledge when I do things or say things that are damaging to other people. So that's a piece in that interview that I wish I hadn't said, that felt unskillful and may have caused harm. Yeah.
Thank you for acknowledging that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the reality, is we're all making mistakes, right? And there is no perfect. And, you know, I've certainly been looking over my own self and my own offerings and, you know, how can I, all that. But there, you know, I think it's definitely, I would hope that it's all brought us into a place of self-reflection, you know, to really sort of go, are we, what feels truthful for us in our body? Are we living up to that? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Like you say, being humble enough just to admit that, of like, oh yeah, I fucked up there. Yeah. I mean, you know, if we could see everybody on the call, it's like hands up who's ever fucked up in their life. You know?
Yeah. But it is so powerful to just acknowledge it. And I think, you know, just as we come toward the end of the interview, because I'm aware of time, we talk about people in power and what's needed. You just use that word humble. And I feel like I've had so many lessons in humbleness in the last few years, and it was so needed. When we're not identified with the power, when we're not identified with the position, when we're not attached to the power and attached to the position, and therefore defending it or justifying it or rationalizing it, that's when, what I notice for me, it's easier for me to say, oh, that was not okay. That was this happening. And I've seen in my own containers, on the occasion when I have fucked up with power, the moment I acknowledge it within the container, the learnings and the sigh of relief and the openings that unfold around it. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, and as you say, like as a woman, it's going to probably show up in different ways than as a man, you know, with the power dynamic for sure. You know, sometimes, you know, for my own self in my containers, you know, I'll be like, I will check in with my assistants. You know, I'm like, was that too strong? Was I like too direct? Was I like, you know? And sometimes they'll be like, yeah, that was a bit strong, or, you know, or not. That's the other feminine, you know, it's as much as I think the shadow for the feminine is kind of to not be, you know, clear enough and to kind of, like we say, pull back and, you know, go sort of, and then we go underneath and then it can come out in weird ways, you know, the manipulating and things like that, you know. So watching our own shadow is a question I've been asking, you know, for a good couple of years as I witness more and more of these male yoga teachers their transgressions coming out. I was like, okay, this is good. And I'd love to see more female teachers in, you know, leading, but we also need to be mindful that our feminine shadow is going to come out. And what is that? And how is that going to play out? And how do we lovingly call one another to account for that?
Yeah, such a good point. Okay, final thing I just want to touch on, Sarsha. So Sarsha and I have been in conversation around creating some kind of form. As some of you will be aware, there are a group of people who've created a form for those who have had abusive or manipulative situations in the ISTA trainings to submit their experience. So Sarsha and I are looking at, well, we've actually created a form, but now we're like, well, when people submit their manipulative or power abuse or sexual abuse experience in our spiritual community here in New Zealand, what then happens, right? Because it's one thing to have a form, but it's really important to hold the people afterwards. What are your thoughts on that at the moment, Sarsha, in terms of what we need to do? Because let's call in some resources, let's call in some support here in terms of what would you love to see happen in terms of a pathway for people to report dodgy dealings.
Yeah, and that's something, as you know, that's come up through the process. You know, it's kind of been a step-by-step process of like, oh, okay, we need to get clearer ethical guidelines into our community and, let's start with the festivals. It's our place to start. But then this realization of like, oh, if we've got ethical guidelines, then we also need to have a channel for people to be able to lay complaints, and we need a third party body to be able to take care of that, because you can't have the person that the complaint, or the organization that the complaint is against, dealing with it, because that is not ethical. And then that is called a body, and they take a lot of time, money, and resources to set up. So, I think that's what we've come to. It's like we've got this, great form, and it's very empathetic. And when I read through it, it was like, actually, my feedback form around if there's ethical guidelines cross could be much more gentle. That's what I learned off your form that you had crafted. But then, how do we need either other people stepping up, or we need some funding, if this is, because it's all very well having these conversations, which are amazing, and, gathering information of what to do, but then it comes to a point where it's like, who's going to do it? Who wants to spend the time? Whoever does spend the time deserves to get paid. Does anyone have the energy that's kind of like, yes, this is really my jam, this is what I want to create, and an ethical board would be amazing across the spiritual community that we could become members of. I think that would be incredible, with someone with the right skill set to do that.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. If there's anyone out there who's really good at writing funding applications and knows how to get funding from different bodies within New Zealand, maybe get in touch. I would potentially love to see the major consciousness festivals here in New Zealand commit some funding, because it would be for their benefit to have such channels set up, for sure. I think you just laid it out really beautifully, Sarsha. So my desire is that this conversation sparks not just more conversations and not just more awareness of the issues, but actual concrete actions. Let's see some shit go down in a good way.
Definitely. It's like, taking that next step for sure. And like I said, I've, clear on, for me personally and in my business, of steps that I'm going to take. And it would be great to see steps in the bigger community getting taken. And I'm also aware that I'm just clear. I'm not that person. I do not have a whole lot of extra time and energy. I'm happy to help and support, but I do not have the hours that would need to go into something like this, because
and this one needs funding. It needs to be funded. It's a job. It needs to be paid. I know I said last thing, but I just heard you say, I'm really clear on the steps I need to take next in my business. Can you just name those steps for because other people might be like, oh, I should do that too. Or I could just get rid of the shoulds. I could do that too.
Yeah.
What are you doing? What are your steps?
So as I said, like for my 200 hour, we have ethical guidelines and codes of conduct. And so I was going over those policies yesterday. And as I said, with the complaint form, I'm going to rewrite that so it feels more inviting. I'm also at a loss though, even with that, like with my yoga teacher trainings, obviously they could file that off to Yoga Alliance, whether they actually do anything about that. That's why it would be good. I would sign up. If anyone wants to create this, I would sign up, because, I need a governing body to help me in case someone's got complaints, about a training that I'm running or about me. It helps me, right? You would hope it didn't get to that level, that they felt they could talk to you or an assistant, but, it might. So one of the things is rewording that form. One of the things is getting my ethical guidelines on my website so that people know that, just getting a lot clearer with my policies. Although I'm going to spend more time on it in my teacher training, of like really not taking it for granted that people know. It's like, oh, people don't really get this, the power dynamic. And teaching more around boundaries and embodied boundaries, and diving into that on my 200 hour and my dance training as well. And again, like we probably even less on the dance training have I gone into ethics. So it's like, okay, I really need to go into that more, because although it's a dance training, not a yoga training, it still needs to be really clear. You're still holding space. And in fact, in my experience, it's often more powerful space than asana. So the other steps, getting it on my website, rewriting and clarifying some of my policies, spending more time thinking about how I'm really going to teach these from an embodied perspective. Yeah.
Awesome.
Continuing that education, like I mentioned, like Amanda Hanna's doing a 20-hour trauma informed, like getting that out more, helping support that to help educate the community. Yeah, and if anyone wants to create a body, I'm there, I'm signing up.
Epic. Sarsha, thank you so much for your conversation, just your time and energy and vibration, and for what you bring and give to this community.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for taking the time, and thank you. I just want to acknowledge, thank you for your patience. So some of you might not know that Kara-Leah actually reached out to me not long after that interview with Matiu and asked me to speak to it, and I was in a really tender, vulnerable place. I was just like, I can't. I felt very emotional. I felt like I could feel the whole collective talking about it. And I really was having to do a lot of self-care, a lot of nurturing. So I just want to thank you for your patience with me and just going, of course, until I could come to a place where I felt in a really, I think this is something to finish off with, is back in my power, because I think that's something that we think it's not like you get it and that's it, you never lose it again. I think it comes and goes, you know, and it's like we have these, as from a tantric perspective, everything is happening for our own awakening, right? And so it was kind of like, oh, I felt like that. Oh. And then it took me a while to kind of integrate all of the pieces and embody it and kind of come back to my center and another layer and sense of empowerment. So it's not that I lost what I had, it was just a deeper understanding and a layer of that came on board. So yeah, I want to thank you for your patience and all your conversations and your time and your energy and all you give to the community. And it's really heartening for me to see, you know, other powerful women facilitators in our community stepping up and holding beautiful space. So thank you. It's been a gift spending so much time in conversation with you.
It totally has. I love the way it's cemented our relationship. Thank you, Matiu, for that gift.
Yes. Totally. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. So this was a conversation with Kara-Leah. There's many more. If you haven't yet watched the Matiu one, please do. There's a couple of others I've done recently with very powerful women as well, Claire Alley and Jacqueline Richards. Thank you for everyone who watched. Thank you for all the amazing comments and questions.